So I am so pleased to be partnering with Lifelong Learning Collaborative on this lecture. We are just wonderful learning more about what you do, and that we get to share our interests and our history with you. So as Jane said, I just wanted to give a little background for those of you who are unfamiliar with Lippitt House Museum. Lippitt House is one of the best preserved Victorian homes in the country. It's a museum today. We offer tours. We have an art exhibition coming up. We have programs on a variety of topics such as this. We have a civics education program for English language learners. And one of our key interpretation themes is the story of 19th century immigration in Rhode Island. Now, the Lippitts themselves did not come to the country in the 19th century. John Lippitt was part of the original English settlement. You can see here in this map that he had a plot down near Wickenden Street. His name first appears in the local records in 1638. But the house itself that the museum is in was built in 1865. And the census from 1875 is quite detailed. So we often use that one to inform our interpretation. The residents of Lippitt House in that year give us a window into what was happening in Rhode Island in the 19th century. So you can see here that Henry and Mary Ann Lippitt are living in the home with their 6 children, but also in the house are 6 live-in servants. 2 of them are from Maryland. William Mason, who was born in Maryland, we know through bank records that his father was from the West Indies. 3 are from Ireland, and 1 was from England. And in fact, in 1874, 56% of Providence population had foreign parentage. Now, also, the Lippitts' wealth came from the textile industry. And immigrants made up a large part of the operatives in both cotton mills and woolen and worsted mills. In the early years, those workers tended to be Irish and English, and they were later replaced by French Canadians, Italians, and Polish. So it is because of this history that we try to incorporate those into our stories, and why we reached out to Heather, an esteemed local genealogist, to help connect this history with how we can better understand our own immigration histories. Heather Pouliot Kisilywicz is a cultural heritage professional experienced in collections management, historic research, and education. She is the Associate Archivist at Tomaquag Museum, where she stewards the special collections, processing catalog, and long-term preservation. She's the principal at Ancestors LLC, an investigative genealogical research firm specializing in unidentified human remains, violent crimes, and unknown parentage. She has a master's in information science and a bachelor of science and marketing from the University of Rhode Island. Born and bred in South County, she is a boy mom for 3 young men, and pickleball is her way of overcoming hours spent reading and researching. And she also is the croquet master at our annual Rose Garden Party in June. And we hope that if you want to meet her in person, that you'll come join us at that event. And without further ado, I turn you over to Heather.
Thank you, Kathy. And I highly recommend coming to play croquet with us in the garden. There's not a better summer event, and it's something I look forward to every year. So I am Heather Kisilywicz, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. So many new faces, and I also want to say hi to some of those faces I recognize, like my South County cousins. Thank you so much all for tuning in. As Kathy mentioned, I'm a professional genealogist. I started when I was 12 years old, and I started tracking my family history and became in love and passionate with all things Rhode Island history. I'm a non-native of European heritage. One of my lines actually goes back to the same settlement that the Lippitts settled with Roger Williams in Providence. Another line is the Irish and French Canadians who came only a couple of generations ago to work in the mills. So I live down here in South County, and when I am working, as Kathy mentioned, I'm at the Tomaquag Museum, the only Indigenous-led museum in Rhode Island, where I have the honor of working with many of the Indigenous communities that descended from the original caretakers of Narragansett. This particular map here is 1903 by Sidney Ryder, and I love how it overlays the original caretakers and the names that they used along with the colonial settlers' interpretation of land ownership. But we're not going to talk about colonialism today. We're going to talk about the second wave of Europeans that came in, and that was between 1820 and 1900. This graph shows a visual example of how dramatic the size of Providence's population changed in just a short period of time. 330% increase between 1820 and 1880, or 1860, sorry. And that was a result of not just people coming from the farmlands to come and work in the industrial mills, but also immigration. That resulted in Rhode Island having one of the highest densities in all of the East Coast, along with Massachusetts and Connecticut, also reflecting the Industrial Revolution. Today, we're going to talk about steam-powered technology that revolutionized the transportation and work in the mills to create a push-pull relationship with immigrants and the jobs that were here in Rhode Island. So with this dramatic change in immigration affecting the demographics, the United States government turned to an invaluable source of information. That's the US federal census. This is a comparison between 1850 and 1880 population of Providence. And we're going to deduce that Rhode Island also, as a state, saw these changes as well. In orange are the number of residents who are foreign born, and they range between 34.7% to 37.5% between the 2 years. Why this is so important is in 1850, it was the first time the census asked every person where they were born, not just the male head of households. Who were the population that was foreign born? Kathy already mentioned the biggest majority was both the Irish and the English, as well as the French Canadians. And we're going to talk specifically about two of those populations, ones that are near and dear to my heart. And that is the first wave that came in 1840s to 1860s as a result of the potato famine and also harsh treatment by the English crown. And then we're going to talk about the second wave in 1865 to 1910 of French Canadians. Can you imagine that by 1910, 7 out of every 10 people were born with foreign descent? So let's start talking about the forces that were pulling immigrants here with better paying jobs. And that's the connection to the Lippitts. Henry Lippitt, as Kathy mentioned, was the 33rd governor of Rhode Island. He was born in 1818 in Rhode Island, and he died in 1891. He described himself on the census as a merchant, but he clearly was an investor and a very successful one at that. He was pro-business and anti-suffrage, and he inherited generational wealth because his father, Warren, and grandfather, Christopher, smartly invested in the Industrial Revolution. This is the picture of the West Warwick Lippitt manufacturing mill that they founded in 1809, that they incorporated in 1853, that was converted from water power because Christopher was a contemporary of Samuel Slater. So we're thinking 1790, we're thinking about the water power technology coming to Pawtucket, and soon after, Christopher Lippitt is investing in this. This particular mill happens to make history. The Lippitts had the oldest running cotton mill in the United States until it stopped operation in 2011. Of course, it went through many names and owners. But the best thing about the Lippitts, the 3 generations of men, is they were good investors and they were in the right place at the right time. That's because in Rhode Island, a quarter of the population was living here, but over 60% of all corporations were located right here in Rhode Island. That's fascinating. When we look at the book about Brown and Sharp and the Measure of American Industry, written by Gerard Carbone, he notes that there are 5 industrial wonders of the world. They all happen to be located right here in Rhode Island during this time period. And the first one is a Corliss steam engine company. Personally, I wasn't familiar with it. I recognized Brown and Sharp. I recognized Gorham Silver. I'd heard about Nicholas File and American Screw Company, but not Corliss Steam Engine Company, which is surprising. Henry's mills not only generated enough efficiency to bring in new workers, but they also created efficiency through using a Corliss Steam Engine Company's invention. And he was at the right place at the right time because he personally knew George Corliss. George was born 1 year before Henry, but in New York. He arrived to Providence in 1837, and with him, he had the third recognized patent in America for a sewing machine. It was to sew 2 pieces of leather together for a shoe. Unfortunately, despite his appeal to find investors, he failed. So he turned to becoming a draftsman and an engineer, and he found a wealth of success there. He came up with an improvement on the stationary steam engine that powered mills like the ones the Lippitts owned. This is the Corliss engine. So envision this large, rigid, slow-moving machine. George didn't really invent the steam engine. Instead, he invented the gear, the Corliss gear, that dramatically improved. It was actually the technology widely viewed at that time, the steam engine, as backup to water power. But he was named the man who did more for the development of the steam engine than any other individual in the history of the country. The Corliss valve became the gold standard of large stationary powered systems. If you're an investor like the Lippitts, you want to know disruptors who come up with new technology. This steam engine and the gear was exactly compared to AI is today, something that people are both awed of and fearful. So Henry Lippitt took advantage of his understanding of this new invention, and he even took the stage with George Corliss in 1876 at the Centennial Fair held in Philadelphia, as pictured here. That's right, George Corliss and Henry Lippitt are on the stage. What happened was Corliss was the commissioner picked for the machinery hall. And after multiple plans failed to power all of the exhibit, Corliss himself developed this oversized 1,400 powered engine. He not only designed it and built it, but he footed the bill himself. So Henry took the opportunity to use this technology in his mills. And if you're interested in anything else about the steam engine, mark off your calendar for the first weekend in October, because right here in East Greenwich, we have a fine example of the New England Wireless and Steam Museum. And they do a Yankee steam up with live demonstrations, and I highly recommend you check it out. So we talked about the Corliss engine affecting the efficiency and changing the work environment in the mills. But who was coming for the jobs were coming via steamship across the Atlantic. And this is a cutaway of the Lusitania's steam engine. The marine steam engine is very different than the one used in the mills. So let's talk about immigration via steamship. In 1818, the SS Savannah was built. It was actually retrofitted. It was a packet ship. See the masts and the sails? Well, it was captained by Moses and Stephen Rogers. They had a good reputation, but even with their good reputation, they couldn't find crew members because this technology of steam engine was considered dangerous. So they had to go back to New London in order to pick up people that they knew they could personally be responsible for with this new technology. So What happened? On May 24th, 1819, the Savannah cleared the port under steam for Liverpool. But we do have to say it took 29 days to get there. And the number of hours of steam power, it was only 80. But that's because there wasn't enough fuel capacity for in the cargo hold to hold it. But consider this the Prius of the steam engine, and it was one of the first ones. From there, technology continued to improve. Like this ship, this is the city of Rome that was built by the Inman Line. And by 1880, when it was pulling into the harbor of New York, where the Statue of Liberty is, it was only taking 8 to 9 days to get across the Atlantic. Speed and capacity were the perfect combination so that more immigrants could come in during this wave via steamship. Compare it to the Mayflower, which only had 102 passengers and completely wind powered. It took 66 days. We know the SS Savannah, with 80 hours of steam power, took 29 days. But then it was cut in half by 1838, right when the Irish immigration wave was starting because of the potato famine. And capacity blossomed to over 1,000. Within 1860, again, it pretty much cut in half. By 1907, it only took 4.5 days to cross the Atlantic in the Mauritania. That was owned by the Cunard Line. And it held that record for 30 years until the Queen Mary broke it in the early 20th century. So if steam power liners delivered one or more of your ancestors, let's take a look at what you might want to do for your research. Remember the 1850 census? That was the first time we were tracking the birthplace of every citizen. Well, the census is always the first place that I go when I'm trying to research someone during this time period. It's an invaluable source of information. In 1870, they started tracking the naturalization status of foreign-born men over 21. In 1900, a critical year for the census for us researchers, they tracked the immigration year, a key nugget of gold. And they also tracked the naturalization status of all foreign-born men. Finally, by 1910, they were tracking citizenship status and also mother tongue or language. That's going to be critical for us who have Canadian relatives to determine if they're French or English speaking. If you're thinking about Ancestry to go for your census, you can. Maybe you already have a subscription, but you do not need to pay to get records from the census. You can go to archives.gov or familysearch.org and get this information for free. Also, don't forget, many of the libraries have access to ancestry.com. You just have to use their computers and you can save some money there as well. One pro tip to consider when you're looking for these names, we're going to go over an example in a minute of a last name that changed multiple times. Since you're not really sure how they might have spelt it on the census, consider using an asterisk in spot for that letter. So if it's a last name that went by Colin or Collins with an S, put an asterisk after the N and it will give you both results. So with this drastic change in population recorded now by the census, the result is social and policy reforms. In 1819, another critical piece of paper was coming out that's going to help you as a researcher as a result of the Steerage Act, which I'll talk about in a second. 1850, we know about the census, but that's also came the repercussions of social reform with a brand new party called the Know Nothings Party. And they were anti-Irish, Italian, and French, or basically anyone Catholic. They also were the people motivated behind the temperance movement and prohibition laws, often creating stereotypes of people who were Catholic and drinking. On the West side, 1880 was seeing the Chinese Exclusion Act after the large influx of the Asian population on the West Coast. By 1890, now that's a long time away since we started talking about 1820 immigration. It wasn't until 1890 that the first federal processing station was opened, and that was Ellis Island. Finally, 1917, the literacy law was created so that it could limit the number of immigrants coming through by passing anyone over 16 was required to take a test. That's the reason why this political cartoon is listed here. Notice how the wall overseen by Uncle Sam is guarded with fountain pens instead of cannons. Well, that 1819 Act, that was to get the names of everyone on board of ships that were coming over. What do we remember about 1819? Well, steam engines were not powering the ships at that point. So we're talking about packet ships that are merchant ships or fishing vessels that immigrants are coming and they're sitting truly in steerage along with the cattle and the cargo. This particular picture shows some women taking advantage of the open air to escape those grim conditions. The reason why we like the act is because it created ship rolls as a mandatory component of any ship coming into port. The information listed here, the name, the age, and occupation of the passenger, the name of the ship, the arrival port and the date they arrived, the departure port, but more importantly, the ports that stopped in between. Because just because it left Liverpool doesn't necessarily mean that's where your immigrant ancestor got on. So sometimes you know the date of arrival from the 1900 census, but you don't know the port that they came in. Before they enacted the federal processing stations, they were state-run, and they were all up and down the coast. Some of the stations that were included were Castle Garden in New York in 1855, Portland, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, and yes, even Providence, Rhode Island was a main port for passenger ships to come in. If you're looking for a great website, write this down, stevemorris.org, O-R-G. That's listed here. Although the website seems a little antiquated, it is full of great information listed by port that you can check for passenger lists of your ancestors. But when I think about immigration, maybe you too, you often immediately think of Ellis Island. And they do have an excellent database that you can use for your research. Reason why we think of Ellis Island is because it was during the largest human migration in modern history, Ellis Island processed more immigrants than all other North American ports combined. But again, it didn't start till 1892. So think about the intensity of the wave of immigrants at that time. The database you need to look up is Ellis Island database. It's the Ellis Island Project, and it's at the statueofliberty.org. Let me give you a case example of what it's like to use that information. All right, we're going to get personal now. This is my family history, and we're looking at the 1900 census. And this is my grandfather, Samuel Girvin, his wife, Edith, children, daughter, and his father, William H. Girvin, who was born in 1826. He's a widow by 1900, and he's born in England. Notice this small clue here. Samuel was born in New York, but he's living in Connecticut now. So this might indicate the port that William came, because he might have stayed in New York before he had his first child. The beauty of the 1900 census is here. He gives the date of 1869 that he arrived, and he has been in the country for 30 years. Interestingly enough, William did not naturalize. He's still considered an alien. So heading towards that Ellis Island database, I typed in William Girvin, and it wasn't 1869, it was 1865 that he actually came. So we always have to keep some ideas of plus and minus when you're searching for people's arrival date. This shows us on the Ellis Island Foundation's website that he came on Plymouth Rock. Remember, just because it's the Ellis Island Project database, it doesn't mean it only has 1892 and on. He arrived in 1865, so it's still useful for you. So here is William Girvan, and here is his wife, Catherine Collins Girving. She unfortunately died in childbirth in New York. Here is a passenger list I was able to track down. Here's Plymouth Rock, and they arrived March 1965, and here is their names. Now, again, there's two things that I used here to feel confident that this is my William Girvan, because we saw that there were a couple listed. One was the date was in a reasonable range, and two, on the passenger list is listed the woman I know as his wife. All right, so let's look at another example of a passenger list. This is the passenger list for the Celtic, which was traveling from Liverpool in 1928. And this is my grandmother and great-grandmother, Dorothy Wakefield, who is actually Dorothy Brown. Notice how there's so many annotations on this. There's another great site you should check out. It's a guide to interpreting passenger list annotations. And I have that link in a handout for you that you can get at the end of this lecture. If you're looking for more information or you're just fascinated by immigration via steamship, there's a helpful resource guide that you can find that I created that's on the Steamship Historical Society's website, sshsa.org. And they're located in Warwick. You never know that they were there because they're booked by appointment, but I highly recommend you call and get a tour. It's a fascinating location. And on that website, you'll also see a recording of a talk I did on immigration via steamship. All right, so now let's talk about the largest population that came via steamship, and that's the Irish wave between 1840 to 1860. But let's talk specifically about Rhode Island. This is the population or number of Irish-born residents in Rhode Island between 1850, the time where we know where they were born on the census, to 1910. And we can see that spike due to the famine and the treatment of the British Crown. Notice how it's spiking in 1890. In 1850, 69% of all foreign-born natives were from Ireland, totaling 16,000 people in Rhode Island. By 1865, it remained steady. 68% were from Ireland. By 1870, Providence ranked 6th among the cities of the nation for the number of Irish-born residents. While both Irish men and women came across on those steamships, there was a trend where the Irish families started sending more daughters than sons. And here's the reason why. So this is a graph that, or a table that was created in 1909 by Providence. And it was the female breadwinners. Isn't it nice, ladies, that they actually started to see us as breadwinners? So here are the jobs that they were doing. This is all countries combined in Rhode Island. The number one employer were woolen mills. Next was servants, third jewelry. And then notice how they actually divided up the types of mills. There's hosiery and knitting here and cotton operatives here. All right, we're going to focus in on Ireland. And the number one employer for Irish is the servant category. So not only did they work in the mills, but particularly women had the opportunity to be servants or live-in servants. So in the 1855 census, they realized in Providence that if they didn't recognize the number of domestic servants they would not have represented in the job, they would have lost the largest population of 2,247 servants and waiters. So the 1855 census is also another great resource. Women were filling the gap in the mills. They were filling the gap because with the steam engine technology, now suddenly the mills were large, dark, loud places where the first wave of women who were working there, which were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, no longer wanted to work there. Where were they going? They were starting to migrate to jobs like clerks and copyists and away from working in woolen mills. So the Irish immigrants were ready to take that role. But I'm going to focus on being a servant, and that's where the Lippitt family comes into play again. This time, we're going to talk about Mary, Henry's wife. She was born in 1823 and died in 1889. And this is a picture from their Lippitt house in 1893. A gorgeous dining room. And if you take a tour of the museum, you'll still see their china set as if they're about to walk in and have dinner. So the demand of servants and housemaids were blossoming because with the industrial age, there was a new number of rich people, or at least well-off middle income. The Lippitts were very well off. So they were able to attract some of the best domestics from multiple backgrounds, but the Irish were strongly represented. The lure with hiring someone who is Irish is there a sense of familiarity. There was at least some commonalities. Some of the Irish were Protestant. They spoke the same language and culture. Often they had an air of familiarity, and they would be some of the closest to the family members in their daily interactions. In 1860, the Lippitts had 5 live-ins. 4 of them were Irish background. The only person that was US born was the nurse, who was spending time in the most intimate setting with their children. Mrs. Lippitt would do the hiring firing, and she'd often do it right on the spot, just like all the other women who had live-in servants. Hopefully, they would find someone with previous experience to do the jobs of cooking and cleaning, because it's likely Mrs. Lippitt really had never lived a life doing those things. Believe it or not, they started publishing manuals just to help heads of households like Mary understand how to supervise her workers because she had no experience doing those jobs. So women like Mary were looking to hire individuals and would give better pay. What was one opportunity was to earn more money if you specialized in working in laundry or cooking. They would often be fired for frivolous excuses. Explicitly, signs would say no Irish. Scott Malloy, who's a historian in Rhode Island, talked about in 1855, there was a rumor spread in New England that a Catholic Irish servant tried to poison her Protestant employers. As a result, many Catholic Irish women lost their job. Signs started to pop up that said no Irish to illustrate the tension that everyone was feeling. Or there would be signs that were very specific. 2 English Protestant girls to do light housework, or a Protestant girl to do cooking and general housework. Religious families preferred. What was it like to be a live-in servant in the Lippitt's household? Well, in 1850, here's what the census reports the family. Now, they're not living where the Lippitt house is today. They're living on 58 Power Street. And here is Henry Lippitt, who describes himself as a merchant, as we talked about before. Here is his wife and his children. And here's Bridget Dolan, 25 years old, female, and she's from Ireland. So we're going to delve into Bridget's life to use it as an example on how you might research your ancestors. So she's one of 2 people from Ireland working in the household. What was it like for her? It was a norm for a live-in servant to work 100 hours a week with 1 evening and part of Sunday off. So here we're going to assume that Bridget likely with this kind of demanding job is single. So her wages would be $2 to $5 per week plus room and board, which was a wonderful benefit. And that's information's right off the Lippitt website. The challenge with researching females is determining whether it's their maiden name or their married name. So let's delve in more on Bridget. Here's the 1850 census. Bridget now is living with William. We know it's Bridget because there were very few Bridget Dolans in that area, and this is the only person who matched the age range. So wait a second. When Bridget was working in the Lippitt house in 1850, she was married. Consider the time period that she's spending with the family with only 1 afternoon on Sunday and one night off, even though she's married. But it probably was a sacrifice that benefited them financially. She's keeping house in 1870. She and her husband are both from Ireland, and she has multiple children. Notice the 16 and 15-year-old are already working to support the household. She's also having children fairly close in age range, 16, 15, 11, 9, 5, and 3. So when it says keeping house versus housekeeping, it means she's home very busy working with the family. So let's go forward another 10 years. Here's Bridget in 1900. She's still living in Providence. She's widowed, but her son William is living next door. Please always read the actual census scan. Don't just go by what they transcribe on Ancestry in that little window. You're missing out on key information that you might not find. So Bridget's a widow. She's 70 years old. Here's a very interesting fact. She had 10 pregnancies and only 6 children living. So her first child we saw in the previous census came after 1850, but we don't know how many births she may have had while she was working for the family and may have lost. So in 1900, she says she was arrived in 1844, and she's been in the country for 56 years. As luck would have it, Bridget and her husband William went to Old Stone Bank to open an account. And that's where I was able to prove that Bridget Dolan was her married name and her maiden name is O'Donnell. Now that I have her maiden name and the year that she arrived, I can try to discover the port that she came in and ship back to the Ellis Island Project and their database. Sure enough, I was able to find Bridget O'Donnell. Here she is on the passenger list, right next to a James O'Donnell. He's only 1 year older. So then the question is this James her brother or a husband? We'd have to do more investigation to figure that out. So not everyone came through the ports along the eastern seaboard, like Portland, Maine, Boston, Providence, etc. Some of them actually came over the border from Canada, because by 1880s, ships were actually promoting an economy route. It was a more direct line to go from England, Ireland over to Canada, and there was an established railroad system that they could use. So they were able to bring all of these immigrants down. Some of them stayed for a period of time, made enough money, and then came down. But they actually had an agreement, the US, with the Canadians, and it was an administrative agreement that they would place US inspectors in the processing stations, and they would adhere to US standards in immigration, which included the inadmissibles would be returned back to Canada. So when you look for records, check out the St. Albans list, write that down. That's going to help you determine if maybe one of your ancestors came across the border after they arrived via steamship. And if they're coming across the border, they're still using steam. It's just a steam engine now in a train. One pro tip to consider, if they came in summer, they generally would come into Quebec and Montreal. And if they're arriving in the winter, they'd often come to Nova Scotia or St. John. Just something to think about. So let's look at someone else in my family, of course, who came across via the steam engine after a steam liner. This is Samuel Bowler. And when you find the declaration of intent for the two-step process of becoming a naturalized citizen, you found a gold mine. This is when genealogists like me do a giddy dance, because the information is so rich on this form. We're going to find out that Samuel had gray hair and blue eyes, stood at 5'8.5" and weighed 180 pounds. Can't you just see him now? He came from Ireland and he worked with the Shannock Railroad, right where the Horseshoe Falls are. And he did not arrive via vessel, he crossed it off. He came via railroad, and he came from Oakville, Canada, into New York. This was the port that he came in. So the two-step process to become naturalized was another social reform that happened as different records started to document how big immigration was in the United States. So in 1790, there was a single stage for 2-year residents to become an American. In 1795, they put a little bit more structure and they made a federalized process. By 1802, they had standardized forms, standard procedures, and then 1906, they had federal standardized forms. The two-step process, declaration of intent, generally filed in local courts. So that's a tip. Look at your state archives for records like this. And then they were filed at least 3 years before they could be admitted into the United States. The second form was a petition for naturalization. And that's what this looks like. There he is. He looks exactly like we described him, doesn't he? That's my great-grandfather, Samuel Bowler. And this is more like an index card because it's a register card. And here it confirms everything that we saw on the letter of intent, a declaration. Interesting thing to check out here are the two witnesses. See if you can research what the connection might be that those people were picked. We know that George Clark owned the Shannock Mill. So it's likely because he worked for George that he was able to get his naturalization register proven. So, okay, he found work, Sam, thanks to the explosive growth of steam engine railroad system. It was the most complete system by 1860 to supply all of those immigrants coming via steamship down into the states like Rhode Island. This is a map that's done of New England in 1860 by George Woolworth Colton. It's a little hard to see because it's so big. Sorry about that. Remember, 1860, that's the tail end of when the Irish immigrants were coming. So who's coming now? It's a second wave, the French Canadians. This is a graph that shows the French Canadian born residents, again, starting in 1850, because that's the first time we were able to find that out on the census, in Rhode Island, and from 1850 to 1900. Between that time period, there was over 1 million French that entered the US from parts of Canada. At least 34,000 of them came to Rhode Island by 1900. The movement was so significant that some Catholic Canadian priests were warning young men about the dangers of military service. What's the connection? Well, they were actively promoting jobs in Canada because there was a shortage of workers because of the Civil War. So the Catholic priests were doing everything they possibly could to prevent this exodus from happening. Where were they going to promote these jobs? Quebec, for the most part. And they're going specifically to the places where recruits were poor, landless, illiterate laborers. And they would include places like this, including Rimouski, where my French Canadian ancestors came from. This is the epicenter of the Roman Catholic Church as well. So we're thinking very large families, close together, but it was the burden of the peasant because the farming of the land had low crop yield, and it was a result of poor soil and poor farming equipment. Basically, the Protestants in that area were the ones who had the good land. And the Catholics who were working a very rocky soil were subdividing it up for as many of their children as they possibly could, which gave a lower yield. It became a vicious cycle. So in 1870, there was hardly any land left. And that is when we start to see the peak of Canadians coming to Rhode Island. What they would do to pay for the train ticket to come down. They would announce that they were having an auction at church on Sunday. They would sell off everything. They would board up the windows of their house and board a train. The result was empty houses all across Quebec. And it was a problem that they were trying so hard to prevent in Canada. In fact, in 1875, there was a tract of land on the American border called La Patrie, and it was established and promoted as a settlement to try to bring people back by giving them free land. After 1 year, it was proven to be a failure. So let's make that connection again. How do the Lippitts tie in to immigration of French Canadians? It's very obvious, isn't it? It's through the mills, like the Lippitt woolen mill that was located in Woonsocket. By the beginning of the 20th century, 44% of the French Canadians were working, hold on, I'm going to do this. Nearly 133,000 cotton textile mills had at least one parent. I'm going to restate that again. By the beginning of the 20th century, 44% of cotton textile workers had at least one French Canadian parent. So Henry and his family also owned the Lippitt mill in Woonsocket that they built in the 1860s. We know Woonsocket as the epicenter of French Canadian heritage. And the reason why is when they were coming down, unlike the Irish, it was much more difficult for the French Canadians to assimilate. They had a different language. They often were illiterate. And there were no established churches or schools or newspapers in their language to help them enculturate, like the Irish, who were widely dispersed throughout Rhode Island. So what happened is, strangely enough, that there was not a Catholic church, a French Catholic church in Woonsocket until 1873. So the French Canadians and the Irish would go to the same Catholic church, and often there would be some real tension that even resulted in fistfights. Despite the atmosphere, the two communities disliked each other. The relationship between them was considered not friendly. So it was difficult. And let's look at the family that worked specifically in a Lippitt mill. This is Pierre Thibault. We're going to see his last name spelled 5 ways to Sunday. And we're going to start with the 1880 census here. Here he is, Pierre. He's going by his French name opposed to Peter. He works in the woolen mill in Woonsocket. His wife, Sophie, is keeping house, not a housekeeper, keeping house. And then so are their children working in the mill that are 18, 16, and 13. Only the 11 and younger are going to school at that point. Notice how we have a clue here. The girls were born in Massachusetts, where Pierre and Sophie were born in Canada. So it's likely that Pierre was able to stop in Massachusetts first, make enough money, and then come back down to Rhode Island. So let's go to 1870 census. Sure enough, that's exactly where they were, in Worcester. How did I know this was my Pierre, even though he's now spelling his name different and going by Peter? Is he going by Peter in Massachusetts because there was less of a culture community? Maybe. He's a laborer, born in Canada. Here's Sophie. So I tied the children together with Peter to know I had the right one. So here are all the iterations of Peter's name that I was able to find through his journey from Canada. He likely arrived in 1857 based on the marriage intent, where he was getting married to his wife Sophie in June. He was in Worcester 1860, 1870, comes to Woonsocket in 1880, and through. And I didn't find out yet when he died. But one thing I did find out is he went by Peter the Boo, the Boo, and his children continued to use that last name instead. So they did choose to anglicize their name. Out of 26,000 in Rhode Island in the year of 1895, 7,000 were working in textile mills. 5,000 French Canadians were unemployed. But by 1895, 13,000 were in other occupations. So I don't want to stereotype French Canadians as only working in mills. They also worked in domestic service, the building industry, transportation, and even agriculture, which makes sense because many of them were leaving the tough conditions that they had grown up in. If you're interested in learning more about your French Canadian roots, we have two amazing resources, both located in Woonsocket. The first is the American French Genealogy Society. Check out the Drouin's records. The Drouin's records are a massive set of information that includes baptism, marriage, burials, and sometimes even parish records. Once you find your ancestor in the Drouin's records, you'll often be able to go back multiple generations from there. Also, at the American French Genealogical Society, they have French-speaking volunteers, and they are a pleasure to work with when they can read these baptismal records to you. Finally, the Museum of Work and Culture is a fantastic spot to stop for half a day and see their exhibit as well. So we made a lot of connections today. So we know that the Lippitts were really a perfect family to be able to look through the eye of immigration because he was an investor, including the Lippitt woolen mill, and it was powered by the coreless steam engine. The one thing that revolutionized the steam engine, so it was no longer water backup power to water, it was the stable power. The Lippitts employed Peter and his family. They were French Canadians who came down via steam engine in the railroads. And then they also employed Irish workers like Bridget Dolan, who is an immigrant who came via steamship. And finally, we talked about the records that were created that are gems for you as you research your family that were made in order for the US to better understand immigration through this time period. Why are we talking about immigration today? Well, it's because, strangely enough, the connection between the past and the present. You can see here, we just talked about the 1800s to 1900s. Well, in the 2000s, we're almost at the same level in the US of foreign-born citizens. What do they look like? Well, at least in Providence, compared to 1880, we have the 2023 demographics, and the largest population is other, which includes everyone from Cape Verde to Haiti to Colombia, as well as the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, China, and India. Just keep in mind this, in 2024, there were more people living outside of their birth country in the world than any other time in modern history. So that's the reason why we talked about the past today. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. So I'll turn it back over to Jane.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Heather. What a very information-packed, fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. We have a question from someone in the audience. The United States had U.S. inspectors at the Canadian border in 1885, but they didn't establish U.S. inspectors at Ellis Island until 1890. So why would they have placed earlier emphasis on the Canadian border than on ports?
That's an excellent question. I can't propose to know the exact answer. I would say it's because they had multiple ports there. We listed 4 ports: Nova Scotia, St. John's, Quebec, and Montreal. So it could have been the volume that were coming. And it could have also been because it was supported by the railroads that were coming through by 1860. So they might have just saw so many coming in that one spot. Also, don't forget, although it wasn't federally regulated in Ellis Island, it was probably controlled by the state. They were using Castle Garden instead. So they might have had a system that was working good enough, but just couldn't support the volume by 1890.
Thank you. Another question is, what were the requirements for someone to get on a ship and come to America? Once in, was everybody considered legal? And then could everybody petition for citizenship?
That's an excellent question. They would come in and they would be considered an alien, and then they could petition for naturalization and then go through that two-step process. As far as the requirements were concerned, I know in 1917 they required the literacy test. Before that, I am not sure. I know that we often hear about inspections of health. And so if someone was deemed unhealthy, I believe that they were turned away. But I don't know the specific requirements. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Another question from the audience, the slide showing the female employed in Rhode Island. What year was that?
1909.
Okay. Well, it is 5 o'clock. So I want to thank you, ladies, so much for this wonderful presentation again. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Absolutely.
And so
thank you, Jane, and thank you, Heather. And this has been a wonderful partnership all the way around.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. You know what? We have time. There's just one more question, if you would please stay. This woman says, I am not French, but she has found many ancestral records for her family at the American French Genealogical Society. And the people there, she says, are extremely helpful and won't discriminate against those who are not French.
Absolutely. And I am so glad you said that. They are very welcoming. And if you need information on genealogy in general, they're a warm group. One group I didn't mention, and I'll leave the thought, is the Rhode Island Genealogical Society is an amazing organization. It's only $35 to join for the year. And they don't focus only on Rhode Island residents to research. It's anyone who's interested in genealogy can join.
Oh, thank you. And again, we've got from the audience to thank you for the great presentation. And so I just want to tell everybody, this ends our winter lecture series, and our next lecture series starts in March. And actually, you actually have probably seen the list. It came into your email a couple of weeks ago or a week ago. And as you can see, it's a pretty good lineup. Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, if you have any ideas of who you'd like to see on this lecture series or topics that you'd like us to cover, please feel free to send it to me. And I'll do as much as I can to get that person or that topic for you. And it's
Jane, may I tell the audience about a related program that we have coming up in March at Lippitt House Museum?
Sure.
So we have, if you're interested in present day immigration, we have a community conversation, building a caring community, building a caring future, supporting Rhode Island immigrants. And we have 3 panelists who will be talking about how they are supporting immigrants in these days. It's an in-person conversation. Registration is required, and that is on Monday, March 9th.
Oh, thank you. Sounds good. So I again, as I was saying, if you have any ideas who you want me to get here for the lecture series, and send it to me. And my email is pretty easy to learn, brownbaglearn@gmail.com. So again, I sincerely want to thank you all for being here with us for this season. And I want to thank you all for the wonderful questions you've been asking the whole season. So thank you, and we will see you again.
And we will be sending handouts to answer the question that just came in.
Okay. Thank you, Heather and Kathy, and we'll see everybody in March. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.